This episode is brought to you by Active Digital, where we help customer-obsessed companies become destination brands. We all know when you have the first thought, you're not talking to anybody, you're just frustrated, right? You're in that moment where you're thinking, this sucks, it could be better. I am crazy enough to believe as a marketer that I can introduce that moment. All right, folks, today we are talking about sales and marketing. Are they from different planets or are they? Do you want to de-commoditize your products and services? Do you want to become a destination brand, increase your revenue, and have more control over your pricing? You're in the right place. Each week, we'll talk about how to create great customer experiences and how to orient your company to enable them. We're your hosts, Devin and David, and this is the Experience Leader Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Back for another week, talking more about things kind of on the sales side. Last week, we talked about CRM. We are going to talk today about whether sales is from Mars and marketing is from Venus. I actually don't think they are, but I've noticed that sometimes they think they are. And so we're going to get into that today. But first, I need to check on my man, David. How you doing, man?
Man, two sales conversations in a row, brother. You know I'm doing all right.
Yeah, man. This is pocket, man. This is pocket for you. I mean, you know, we both have been in sales. You way more than me. I love sales. The way I look at sales is I look at it as just sharing enthusiasm. You know, I don't like selling anything I don't believe in, and if I believe in it, it's easy to sell. I got no problem with it.
Truer words never spoken, my friend. Yeah, dude. It's a heck of a lot easier to sell something when you can just talk freely about it and know that what you're saying is real, right?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And people feel that, right? People feel that. Let's jump into first why sales and marketing can sometimes get off beat. I've been at a few places now. I've been around for a while. I've noticed that at just about any company, the tendency can be there for sales to feel like marketing is not doing what marketing should be doing, for sales to want marketing to report to them so they can make sure marketing's doing what they're supposed to be doing, and vice versa. Marketing feeling like, you know, well, sales screws it up. We're getting them the fish. They ain't cleaning them, you know. I think that sometimes without the proper leadership, honestly, without the proper incentives, et cetera, they can look at the world in different ways or to be pressured to behave in ways that actually don't wind up working in the best interest of the company. I love to know your take, your experience, your storied experience.
Yeah, man. I mean, you're right. You see it everywhere, right? There's this kind of push and pull a little bit between those groups on what's most important, how they're incentivized, how one views its role versus the other. It's funny, man. I think sometimes, you know, you get into these temporal conversations around, well, who's driving long-term brand, who's driving short-term transactional, hit the numbers, et cetera. And honestly, this would extend even as you get into more of that customer care delivery side of the house as well. I don't think it stops with sales and marketing, but even just looking at those two groups, what's always really interesting to me when you actually get into the detail is that each of those groups individually actually struggles with short-term versus long-term, right? So if you talk to a marketer, you'll get kind of the brand discussion, and then you get but we run campaigns, right? So it's like, we do brand, we do campaigns. So long-term, short-term. On the sales side, it's always this pull between new logos, hit the numbers right now, et cetera, and lifetime value of the customer. What does it mean to go deep and wide, land and expand, all that good stuff, really just account management, right? And that becomes kind of the push and pull. And then you smash those two things together and you've got this weird, it's not even a quadrant, it's messier than that, right? It definitely it can get confusing if you allow it to, because you're actually, even just with those two groups, arguably, you could create permutations that you have, 10, 20 different versions of what's most important just amongst those individuals, right? So we can talk more about that, but I think sometimes it's even more complicated than just the handoff and the overlap. It's also just internally those teams struggle a little bit with like, well, what is most important to us? And we'll talk a little bit about customer and how that becomes a bit of a common tie or doesn't, right? But without that, I do think that you get these funky incentive structures that just cause people to really feel like they're in opposition to one another.
I think that you nailed it on the short term versus long term, because it's easy for a marketer who is more focused on short term to miss the long term benefit of brand building, but vice versa. Somebody who's solely focused on brand building doesn't serve up leads in a timely fashion, doesn't help cash flow the way that marketing is supposed to. And I think that as I've been around in marketing, my background is half product and strategy, half advertising and strategy, I guess. One of the things that I realized on that side was essentially that you can wind up having marketers who at large companies who don't really know how their activities impact sales. And that, I think, is one of the biggest issues I've seen at enterprise level companies. You have marketers who are running major initiatives who have no idea how their activity impacts sales. And therefore they don't care enough about it.
I agree. And that's why I say, like, it's not as you would love to think, okay, well, if we just align long-term marketing stuff with long-term sales stuff, that would be the answer, right? I wish it was that easy. And actually, you could argue that it's easier than that, but we'll come back to that in a second. But when you're trying to do that, well, that doesn't make sense, because driving brand over time, it's not just that brand is driving lifetime value, on the customer side. It's not driving necessarily current account management. That's part of it, but it's also giving you the ability to find new customers, right? So it's actually driving more of the transactional behavior on the sales side. And vice versa, right? If you look at the sales side of the house and what they would consider to be long-term, right? So how do we keep these customers? How do we expand within them? How do we continue to sort of expand our value to them over time? Well, that has a tie-in to brand, but there's also, frankly, some account-based marketing probably that needs to happen, which is more of the transactional. So you end up with all these like, okay, it's not as simple as just, okay, let's get the short-term thoughts on both sides aligned on the long-term. To your point, it really has to be, okay, on marketing side, what is it that you folks think that you're driving? And to your point, how does that drive sales, both new logos and how do you expand within existing customer sets that you already have? And specifically, when those handovers happen, or just as influence happens, moving customers along their journey, right? What does that look like? Really, I hate to say it, like that's the only that's the only way to look at this that isn't confusing. Any other way of looking at it, and you end up in those awkward conversations that we've all been in internally, where everyone tried something for 3 months, and then it's like we're back to the drawing board, and basically we're just trying the next thing, and then we try the next thing, and it's like, well, okay, let's change reporting structure or incentive structure, or it's all the things that kind of, you just keep going around and around the wheel.
Oh yeah.
Of, well, what if we focus more on this, and the answer a lot of times is okay, but again, like what is that relationship that each of these teams have to moving a customer along their journey? And the truth is, like, there's going to be some overlap. It's going to be messy a little bit, but it shouldn't be messy for the customer.
That is absolutely right. And that is the common denominator. If you're looking at it from the perspective of helping the customer buy, right? If you're looking at it from that perspective, because if you think about the way that marketing operates, they're making a promise, they're selling the company and the product or service before you get in contact with a human. There are instances where there are plenty of companies out there where you, if everything goes right, will never have contact with a human, right? I have never spoken to somebody from customer service at many of the electronics companies that I have bought products from, right? That's great, because that means it worked. I didn't have a reason to talk to them.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything that I experience from those companies comes from marketing. So marketing is selling, right? Obviously, people who are in sales, they're selling. We don't need to really dive into that. It's obvious. But the question is, what's the primary motivation there? What's the primary objective? And the objective should be to help the customer make progress, right? The old saying, I don't know who to attribute this to because I've heard so many people say it. I've looked it up. But, the old saying is nobody likes to be sold, but everybody likes to buy. Help them buy, right? It's true. We recognize it. Like, we don't like to be sold because, we think there's a conflict of interest there. Of course, this person wants to sell me this product because that's how their incentive structure is based. Even if it's not, if they don't sell anything, they don't get to have a job. So I don't care whether they make commission or not. They need to sell, right? Or they don't get to have this position. They don't get to have income. So there could be a potential conflict of interest there. But if you focus on, okay, what is this person trying to accomplish? Where are they trying to make progress? Can we fit in? There's a lot that I could get into here. I don't want to suck all the air out of the room because I could probably talk on this for an hour without taking too many breaths. I want to ask you, as a guy who has had his feet to the fire in a straight up sales role, when you hear somebody say that, is there a part of you on the inside that's like, BS, like that's not the real world? Or are you like, yes, I've done that and it's driven revenue? I'd love to know your perspective.
Yeah, I think and this is a real answer. It is also something that is aspirational, I think, for most companies, right? So I'll caveat that, right? What I'm about to say is it's not the norm for most organizations, but I also don't think that it's out of the question of reality because I've seen it play through at different levels of adoption, etc. I don't think that there is a huge difference between, and this is where it gets funny, right? So I don't think there's a big difference between looking at how a customer buys, why they buy, right? In other words, what is that to your, to use the words that you just used, what is the progress that they're trying to make, right? If you look at that and you say, okay, we happen to arrange our team with a marketing team and a sales team and a customer success team and a blah, 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 blah. The product folks are over here. And great. That's a decision that the organization makes on how best to organize. How the customer moves through their process is unrelated to that in terms of how the organization should. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to organize around that as well. That's a nice aspirational state additionally. But when it comes to selling, if you really look at like, okay, well, how do we move any one of our customers along that journey? What's funny to me is that you go through that process and you start identifying the points in that journey that can most be influenced and what is meaningful to the customer at those particular points in the journey. The results of that type of, sort of research and just really digging deep into, hey, where can we make the most impact? Even pre-sale, right? Just as we're getting the customer to the point where they're willing to be a customer, they're willing to buy, they're willing to kind of become a part of our family, right? The results of that are not these like weird, fluffy, like they're still real things that sales or marketing or customer service has to act on, right? And I think a lot of people that have that visceral reaction, like, all right, Devin, like, I get it. It's all rainbows. And like, we should definitely just be figuring out what progress they're trying to make. I think a lot of salespeople have that reaction of like, no, like, I just need to sell. It's volume, it's numbers. There's a funnel. And if you do this and you do this and you do this, like, here's what comes out the bottom. And as long as that number is big enough, like, we're all good, right? But the output of what you're talking about, actually, it just drives behavior. That doesn't change the math. It doesn't, like, all those things that are proven from a mechanical standpoint. On the marketing side, when you talk about outbound campaigns, when you talk about brand reach and how to do that effectively, how to use channels effectively, how to use all these cool tools that are out there right now that allow you to kind of measure whether or not you're being productive on that side of the house, none of what we're talking about takes away from that. But there has to be a lean and a method to the madness, right? I think what you and I are very much aligned on is that method can't be measured. The measurement of that can't stop with, well, how many calls did I make? What was the topic of the conversation? It ultimately needs to be measured by, are we moving people from left to right on their version of the process, right? Not our version, not our funnel, but their version of the left to right, meaning the customer. Are we allowing them to be educated? Are we allowing them to really understand how we can be of value to them and then make that decision to join up with us? And whatever that is, that product that we're selling, the service that we're offering, like that's just a real way of adjusting behavior slightly for the sales team or for the marketing team for that matter.
I think that's great. And you're exactly right. The math doesn't change. The business has to do what it has to do. Now, there are ways, okay, you can set quotas, you can set targets in a way that causes people to have to cheat, to have to break the rules in order to succeed, in order to hit their targets. I've been there. I've been at a major company when that happened. It was bad for everybody involved. So you can wind up setting the math such that people can't win, and then they've got to start breaking the rules and doing uncouth things, even illegal things, in order to keep their jobs. That's not par for the course. Generally, targets aren't unreasonable. They may be aspirational in some regards. Having a number to shoot for, to push ourselves to, is good to incentivize us to grow. What you wind up getting in some organizations is a complete focus on the numbers, because I've been there. I personally think that everybody should have at least one sales job in their life. I think they should have one sales job. If you need to get it out of the way while you're a teenager, fine. But my experience before I really got into the corporate world in retail, I saw the numbers weren't unreasonable, right? And my philosophy there towards selling generally was to help the customer figure out what they wanted. I sold computers. I'm a computer nerd, so that was easy for me. I was very enthusiastic about that whole area, and so it wasn't hard for me to do that. And I would have whole families, thanking me after they bought a bunch of stuff, right? But I also saw my colleagues sometimes, when they were just completely focused on numbers, they were focused on crushing numbers. They would sell things to people that they definitely didn't need or didn't want. And while the numbers would look good that day, I would see that person come back within the return period, sometimes the next day even, and bring back a cart full of stuff because they were sold the thing that helped the numbers the most, but not what was most appropriate to them. And I'm not saying that everybody's out here doing that. I don't want people to take it that way. But I do think that there is a way to hold both sides of the coin. As you said, it doesn't change the math. And I think the math is attainable, right? But if you look at it the other way, in my opinion, you can hit the numbers and crush them if you're focused on helping people. And I actually think that is also brand activity. That is affecting customer experience and therefore affecting your reputation. And people are going to tell their friends, you're going to build a reputation around that. And I think that you'll wind up being extremely successful by doing that. I know people have been mentored by people who have taken that approach, and their name is like gold to anybody it gets passed to because they sell that way.
When you talk about numbers, quotas, whatever, it not dissimilar from the discussion of the journey that the customer's on, the buying journey that they're on, or really just the journey that they're on even beyond the buying process. Neither one of those start and stop with sales or marketing for that matter, right? So, you brought up a good point around, in the retail world, the concept of returns, right? And what that does and how you need to plan for that, right? Well, to the point that you're making, if 50% of the stuff you sell comes back in the door within a return period, well, there's a couple things there. Number one, the business needs to hopefully it doesn't need to stay that bad, and there are things you can actually change, right? So you can adjust the process of why they bought stuff they didn't need in the first place, etc. But let's assume that there is some reasonable amount of returns that occur. Any retail store that's brick and mortar has to deal with theft and a bunch of other stuff, right? These are all that's just part of running the business, right? So you factor that in to what makes the business successful. If the thing that was easiest to sell is also the thing that people steal the most, you may still want to adjust how much of that you have on hand, right? As an example. And that's an example that extends beyond okay, if you were only optimizing for sales, you might just stock up on that. But because there are other factors, either from a customer care perspective or just things that are non-sales but are still impacting that part, like you have to factor all of that in. Once, and that's on the leadership team for the business, right? That is not on the sales team alone, the marketing team alone, et cetera, right? That has to be, we talk a lot about this, that has to be the business looking at what's important to us. How do we think about success, right? In terms of what we do, and ensure that we've got a good handle on that before we start making, quotas for the sales team, or before we start directing the marketing team to run campaigns on stuff that frankly would just lead us down. It's going to look great for 3 months and then it's going to be a disaster after that, right? So I think there is this, you called out at the beginning, there's the question of incentivizing and how you look at these teams and how they operate. And then there's the question of leadership. And really it starts with leadership, right? It starts with understanding who are our customers, what's their expectation from that very first touch point all the way through. And that could go on indefinitely, as we know, right? It starts with understanding that and then looking at any part of the business. I don't care if it's your product team, your sales team, your marketing team, and saying, all right, given what we know or what we think we know, this is how we're going to align your incentives, your organization, et cetera, to succeed in that way. So yeah, it definitely, even that subject of math, it's not as simple as just start with the sales team and figure out what the top line number needs to be. It's, do we understand the impact on the business? Okay, now let's talk about growth. Let's talk about some of the things that we want to achieve together. And the other stuff, like the blocking and tackling, that's all it is, right? It's no different than a car company that figures out how to really provide an amazing experience to a car buyer, let's say online, where there's a lot of customization involved. And then they go and they basically retool the factory to allow for more of that mass customization than they used to, right? It does, they made the change on the customer side because that's where the expectation of the demand was. And that's great. They still had to go to the factory and make that real, right? Sales is no different. Just because you are looking at things through a different lens, you still have to then make the mechanical changes around, okay, if we're focused on this, incentivize, like the incentive structure is going to change, but it's going to change in this way, right? Quota is going to look like this now, but here's why, right? And maybe we're not even basing it on, maybe we're adjusting even what quota means. Is it new logos or is it, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways to kind of pull that through that start to align, again, the definition of success for the company with the definition of success for the customer base for the reasons you called out.
Like I said, it goes to leadership, right? How are you setting the direction? So much of how we deal with making sure that sales and marketing is aligned, really everybody else, right, is determined by that. Culture obviously plays a big part of that, and that's why I advocate so much, right? We wouldn't have a show here if we didn't think that this stuff worked and know that this stuff works. It's why we advocate for it, right? If I was just here blowing smoke, then I think David probably would have left by now. But I think that when you can get a cultural dynamic that is always focused on trying to move somebody along that buying journey, that's always trying to think about, okay, if we can help them as much as possible when they're at this stage, right? When they are at the first thought stage, the passive looking stage, to use Bob Mesta's timeline here, we all know when you have the first thought, you're not talking to anybody, you're just frustrated, right? You're in that moment where you're thinking, this sucks, it could be better. I am crazy enough to believe as a marketer that I can introduce that moment. I can show somebody that there's better. Once I understand the market enough, understand what people want enough, understand the job to be done, I can use that in my marketing to show somebody, to even bring up something they might not have thought about and be the catalyst for that first thought. What I don't want people to think is, okay, well, you don't really have a shot at this thing until the person reaches the conclusion that they want to change it themselves. There's nothing you can do, right? I think that you can catalyze that, in my opinion.
Agreed. I think, one of the, I spent a little bit of time at Red Hat, and that was via acquisition. So for me, a lot of the open source dogma that and I don't mean that negatively, but Red Hat really led the charge on what is now, frankly, like almost more commonplace than not. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, definitely not the case, right? That was the exception and not the rule in terms of how things worked at Red Hat, and frankly, what their kind of software, if you will, meant to the larger market, right? I look at the tactics that were used just to kind of paint that picture of like what else is out there, right? I mean, there, at the time, it's like, of course, you've got IBM and you've got Oracle and you've got Microsoft, and well, and that's really about, particularly, when you talk about the OS side and just more of the deeper tech side. And you watch a company like Red Hat who had a couple of hurdles, right? I mean, number one was just frankly getting in the conversation at all, because it was just so decided that there were only a couple of options out there. Number two, even getting in the conversation, but this isn't this thing that you're selling me, like you guys don't even make it, right? It's kind of made by, I don't know what, a bunch of people that are spread across the globe, and y'all are just like collecting pieces and then reselling. It was an interesting pattern to watch from what what you just described, which was, okay, but none of that, there are extreme advantages to open source, et cetera. And there are things, but more of it was just like, what is the possibility? And can you help people to see like, oh, I can run my business on this model, and the costs are nowhere near where they were with the other options that I'm using. And oh, by the way, and there's always that kicker, right? It actually may be more secure than what I'm using right now, which is like a big ironic punch in the gut, because I'm pretty sure I was paying $20 million because I thought it was the best, right?
That's right.
That's not to debate OS strategies or anything like that on this podcast. It was one of those like, okay, get somebody thinking like there might be another option other than the two or three they had in their head, and then hit them with the, oh, by the way, like the main reason you're spending all this money, like you might actually be backwards on that, So that has everything to do with the progress that major companies were trying to make at that time, and still are on that topic, around so much of this stuff is moving to digital, whether it's our infrastructure that we're running on site or even as we start to push into third parties. People are trying to figure out, how do we run our business with all of this cost and all of this stuff, right, that we now have to support? And that was an eye-opener, right? It was like, okay, that's a way. That is a way to make this shift occur, where more people are going to be in front of a screen versus, whatever they were doing before. And we can do it at a cost that the business can actually handle.
Absolutely. When you're doing that and you're showing somebody, hey, the way you were thinking about this, or the options you thought you had, there are more options, right? Generally, when you do that, what you're doing is you're expanding their mind to consider other possibilities. They're not necessarily making a decision right there, right? But they are now kind of they've broken the mold of, I got to go with either this big co or this big co, or just option one, option two. These are the incumbents. These are the only two real viable options, and I'm stuck with one or the other. When you introduce another way, that may be even a whole paradigm shift of solving a problem, right? The beauty of understanding what somebody is actually trying to achieve is that you can introduce solutions to that might be out of left field, might be counterintuitive, but once it's introduced, if it actually solves a problem, right, they're thinking, well, yeah, that might be a thing. Let me explore this further. You get them into that passive looking stage. Now the door is open, right? As a sales guy, I'm thinking, hey, once the door is cracked, that's all I need. Just give me the cracked door. This is prime time when people are just exploring options, especially right now, right? I think it was Gartner that did some research, and they think that by, I think they said 2025, I think they expect 80% of B2B, like we're talking B2B here, because we already know B2C people do most of their research online. You may never even talk to them, right? They're thinking by 2025, because of the differences in behavior between generations, right? Millennials versus Gen X versus boomers. You think baby boomers are definitely more likely to want to talk to you on the phone, right? They're more likely to want to engage with you in person. Millennials flipped. They think that 80% of the B2B buying process is going to be without human contact. It's still, it's prime passive, that passive looking stage, prime time for marketing. I think it's only going to grow. I think it's only going to grow to where you're going to have to be extremely savvy at one, understanding your customer really, really well and knowing channels to engage on and doing that in increasingly valuable ways. The passive looking stage, every stage, you're trying to provide value for the customer. But I think at that passive looking stage, you have to be able to provide content, to have messaging, to demonstrate that you have their best interest in mind. You provide value. You're helpful. Again, kind of shifting the focus from let's stop talking about selling and start talking about helping. You're trying to help, and that's coming through clearly. And you're going to have to increasingly do that without relying on person-to-person interaction. I'm not saying that that's going to go away. I personally think that given COVID, I think people are a little hungry for person-to-person interaction. So I don't know if I 100% agree that it's just going to go that way in perpetuity, but I do think it is going to trend to more rather than less right now.
All the things you're describing around just access to information, the collation of that information into packets that I can kind of consume and understand, even in a passive sense, right? So in other words, just packaging up certain facts or pain points or whatever in a way that's like, I as a consumer, even in the B2B space, as a consumer, I've just never thought about it in that way, right? I've never thought about my problem set in that way. I've always just assumed that like, okay, well, I have similar problems to a bunch of other people and there are only so many paths you can take, et cetera. It's a lot easier to, frankly, get in front of folks with a different way of looking at their problem sets. And not only that, and this is really, to me, like where the shift is happening. Even, you don't have to go back very far to where it was very difficult to educate people on their problem set. So you were still playing the game of, okay, but we can solve that problem in a different way, right? And that so you had to break through that. Even my Red Hat example, to some degree, it started to open up the conversation around, well, maybe the thing you're trying to do isn't even the thing that you think you're trying to do, right? But it didn't really start there, right? It just started with, listen, yeah, we get it. This is the part of your business that you're running on this stack. Here's a different way of doing that, and you've just probably never thought about doing it in this way. But where you get to the real, the deeper conversation is actually redefining the problem set sometimes. When you use digital channels in ways that do that side of things, now, frankly, you're accelerating the entire process. And this is why marketing and sales, it's not as cut and dry anymore as, first we market and then we sell, right? Because you start changing somebody's problem set, that can be an extreme accelerant to where they're like, well, okay, if I was all wrong about the problem that I thought I had, or I'm just now enlightened to the problem that I actually have, doesn't matter, take either, those both result in the same thing, which is I actually want to act now. Versus, okay, cool, you showed me a better solution, I'm interested, I'm even willing to switch, but I'll switch in a while, right? Like I don't need to switch tomorrow necessarily. When you start changing people's problem sets a little bit, that'll cause people to want to jump now. And from a digital perspective, what that could mean is they are getting educated, they are clicking, they are realizing that maybe they were a little off base with how they had viewed that problem before, and then they're clicking again to buy, right? And that is, there isn't really it's still a step, but they're moving to active very quickly, right? From a looking standpoint. And they're already processing like, hey, maybe I'm all in on this, right? So there isn't even this clean divide between, that's marketing activity versus that's sales activity. It's like, no, those are one and the same now for a lot of businesses, including B2B scenarios. Certainly the B2C world at this point has, those things have melded together. I mean, it's hard to pull them apart if we're being honest, right? But even in the B2B world, we're definitely moving in that direction.
You're reading my mind on some of this stuff, man. So many good things here. I gotta try to capitalize on a couple of these. So you talked about the idea, let's hit off with, the lines between sales and marketing are going to blur. They're going to blur even more, especially in the B2B space, as people tend to do more of their research and their shopping without having human-to-human contact. Absolutely. Like you said, B2C space has been like that for a while. I think that there is no spoon. When I think about that stuff, there is no spoon. Having been on both sides of that, I think that when I was in sales, I always wanted I always wanted more firepower from marketing. I wanted marketing to bring somebody teed up, right? When I'm in marketing, I want sales to sell and prove that my stuff works so that I could keep my job, right? I think that there's going to be probably a shift of roles and responsibilities of what sales looks like in the coming years. I'm sure that's already happening. We probably have people listening that are like, oh, it's already happening at our company. Like, what you guys are talking about is already a thing. I think it's going to become more commonplace, though. The other thing you talked about, which is huge, which we already know, people have been talking about this for quite some time. It's not new. Educating. Educating used to be the job of the salesman. Marketing did that to a certain extent. If you think about David Ogilvy, right? David Ogilvy, famous copywriter, did a lot of groundbreaking things, demonstrated that you could have long form copy for an ad and people would keep reading as long as it was interesting. He would go super in depth. If you haven't read Ogilvy on advertising, highly recommend folks that you read that. But an example is like a Rolls-Royce ad. Goes into detail about the car. An ad that goes into detail about the car, talks about that stuff in depth. You are educating there. And that was an example of what happens now, right? Like that's commonplace now for you to have that super in-depth information available without having to come into contact with somebody. When that was being done by pioneers like Ogilvy with different brands, and we're talking back in the 70s for crying out loud, that wasn't commonplace necessarily. And now, obviously it is commonplace, but we're going to have to get to the point where that education, we've seen that it has to get more entertaining. The bells and whistles on it have to get better. But I think that we will find, as we tend to move on with this trend of more people getting their education without talking to a salesman, that sales is going to be involved in the process of educating without having that contact. They're going to have more of a say. They're going to have more of a seat at the table with how that stuff is done. They're going to have to in order for everything to work right, in my opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we're in that phase at this point, right? I mean, if you think about all the industries that have been not just disrupted, but I mean, completely flipped on their side at this point, where a brick and mortar store with a salesperson and a cashier and a this and a that, like all of that structure that existed, that once that got moved to a Shopify site, okay, that's different, right? And think about the people that are employed that are then creating that experience, driving that experience, et cetera. Well, like there was a moment, and some organizations are still stuck in this and struggling with it, but there was a moment where the pendulum swung so hard that you basically had technology people that were trying to create that. And that's a bad idea, right? Yeah. So all the people that actually knew how to service the customer kind of got left out for a few years. And you had a bunch of people like me that were in there, coding something up and being like, yeah, see, there's your store online. It's like, that is not a substitute for what we used to have.
Yeah, that's right.
We increased our reach. That's good. This does not feel like that store we used to have on, Main Street. So lots of industries have gone through that and are now realizing, okay, the digital representation of the thing has to be driven by people that understand a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in this conversation, right? Which is, who is the customer? How do you lean into the things that delight them and encourage them to keep being curious and ultimately to make a decision, right? So you have that happening, in the e-com world, but you also see it with take insurance, right? And just the role of agents and brokers. And 15 years ago, that was very much we're talking face to face, and my education is coming from my agent, and I'm asking questions about, well, how much coverage do I need, and why do I need that, and if I need to make a change, like I'm probably getting on the phone or going to his or her office to make that change. It's crazy, man. This morning I had someone on financial side for me had said, hey, you need to adjust home insurance for these like 3 reasons. So just go ahead and get that taken care of. It usually takes a while, and then just hit me back with the updated policy when you have it. I'm like, all right, cool. This is a different topic, but I happen to use Lemonade mainly because I was a nerd and like wanted to see what it was like to go through the process. And then as I started, this is when we built the home a couple years ago. When I started, I was like, oh, well, actually, now that I'm in it, this this will work. Here was the crazy thing this morning, man. Like, so I went through, all I was doing was basically increasing coverage, right? That was it. But the way my account's set up, there was an auto draft from a trust and blah, 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 blah. So like they didn't have a card on file that they could adjust it. So I go to do it. It says, you can't do this until this. Boom, click the button. Had a chat bot that was basically like, click here, add your payment details, done. That took 15 seconds because LastPass, add details, done. Takes me back to the screen. Now it's an option. Literally click the right arrow a couple of times until the number that was X became a little more than X, which is where I needed to go. Waited like 10 seconds for the site to be like, okay, cool, that's your new number. Here's what that means for your annual. Got an email with the policy attached as a PDF. That took all of like 120 seconds. That would have taken a month. Straight up, like to go to my agent down the street or whatever, talk to her, have her do a thing that then has to go over probably back to underwriting for them to like make sure that it's okay that David wants to, bump up whatever. And then probably have 3 questions. I mean, it's crazy, dude. Like we're in that mode now where that customer experience, and that, by the way, like what I just described is more revenue for Lemonade, right? Now, it also upped their risk and everything. I mean, that's the business model of insurance, but it's more revenue. I'm paying them more now than I was a few hours ago, right? I use that as an example of sales. It's not about any one point in the process. Like we are now at a point where that stuff is blended together. Like you talk about it a lot, man. It's a virtuous cycle at this point, right? It is the same expectations I had coming into that relationship. And oh, by the way, I kind of expected that from Lemonade because they market themselves that way. And like I was impressed, but I probably wasn't surprised in a good way. I was like, yeah, these folks know what they're doing. I won't pick on any specific insurer, but if I would have been using a different insurer and that happened, I'd be like, whoa, like you guys figured this out. But so even the marketing team, right? Like they have built themselves up as we do this right. And then as a customer now, it's like, yeah, check. You can take more of my money. That's fine. Like made me happy and made my financial person happy. And like, we're all good. So anyway, pretty interesting to watch what's happening now, but it just points to like the lines are blurring completely. Like this stuff just there aren't these definitive handoff points.
Man, that is awesome. I think that it's a great example right there of where I think a lot is going. Even at the enterprise level, I think we're going to see it shift more there. Obviously, for big ticket enterprise purchases, I think it's going to be a long time, and maybe there'll always be a human component there because there's an element of risk mitigation and looking somebody dead in the eye that might be necessary. But I mean, we've said that about things before, and they changed. So don't hold me to that. This has been awesome. I think that there's so much more that we could dive into. I'd like to keep moving through that timeline of just touching on these different aspects of the buying process. I really, really am looking forward to hearing from your perspective as well, just some of how those later points in the buying process are going to change in the future and how you can do that from a CX standpoint. So we will talk about sales, full-on sales and CX, folks. Until then, we really appreciate you listening. Send in your questions to devin@experienceleader.com. And until next time, keep outserving your competition on your relentless pursuit to become an experienced leader. Thanks for listening.